Have you ever wanted to make a sewing machine dust cover with an opening for your handle? Today, we're going to make a special one that not only has an opening, but also has a flap to protect your sewing machine. It also has side pockets that are super practical to carry your foot pedal and electric cord. I've designed this fabric specially for this project, so let's go ahead and make it and learn all these sewing tips along the way. Welcome to the Luli Prints Sewing channel. I've decided to make this new cover based on the feedback that you guys gave me in the previous video on this sewing machine cover. Some of you suggested an opening to reach for your handle, and then also you guys asked me how to create that neat border at the bottom, and to explain in a little bit more detail some of the steps. So this video tutorial is full of sewing tips that you're gonna learn and gonna be able to apply in many of your sewing projects. We're gonna need 1 yard of our main fabric and 1 yard of our lining fabric. I like to use an accent fabric for the flap, and also we're gonna be using a double fold bias tape to finish that flap. One thing that I really recommend for this project is the Bosal double-sided fusible foam stabilizer. I'm gonna make sure to leave the link in the description, but it does really help with the structure of our sewing machine cover. And then for the pockets, this is optional, but I'm using mesh fabric with elastic, so it's a little bit stretchy. But you can use the fabric of your choice, maybe with some bias tape as a binding and finishing touch. All right, let's measure our sewing machine. We're gonna need the width, the length, and the height. I have a Brother SE 600 and it's a little bit under 17 inches, but I just wanted to have a round number so it's easier to work with those measurements. And we're gonna go ahead and add an inch or an inch and a half so we have room to work with our seam allowance. I'm gonna be using a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, but then we're gonna be finishing the borders with a 1/2 an inch seam allowance. So please make sure to leave some room for that so we can work comfortably. And one last thing, when you're doing your measurements, please don't forget to add the hand wheel or the top of your bobbin winder or anything that comes out of the main body. For our next step, we're gonna measure our handle so we can create a template for our opening. So I created a template that's 18 inches long by 8 inches. Don't worry, I actually have a slide with all the measurements at the end of the segment so we can all use for a reference. So make sure to just write down all the main measurements, for example, the distance to our handle, the width of our handle, and the length of it. I actually made a template out of fabric as a practice just to make sure that everything was in the right place and also to see if the border was going to show the way I wanted to. I did it out of fabric just because I wanted to make sure that I had everything ready to make this video. I wanted to know all the distances and like the different spacing, and also I wanted to make sure I had space for the flap that I decided to create to make it better so we don't get dust inside our sewing machine. So to create your template out of paper, I suggest you start cutting your paper with the same dimensions that's going to be your top panel. So mine is 8 inches by 18 inches long. And then go ahead and mark your rectangle, making sure that you have enough space to reach for your handle and also account for your seam allowance while sewing the flap right at the top. So make sure not to put your rectangle very close to the top edge. We just want to make sure that the hole is not right at the edge and we have enough room for our seam allowance. Alright, now that we have all the dimensions, we're ready to start cutting our fabric. Feel free to pause this slide so we can have it as a reference. So for our main fabric, we're going to have 5 different panels: the front, the back, the left, the right, and the top. For our top panel, for now, we're just going to cut the main rectangle. We're going to go back to our top panel later on in a different segment that's called sewing the handle opening. I designed this fabric to coordinate perfectly with the other fabric that we used in the previous sewing machine cover. I think it's so fun to have around in our sewing room, so I will make sure to leave the link in the description if you want to go ahead and check it out. So if you want to go ahead and pause this slide, you can have it as a reference to check our dimensions for the lining fabric. We're going to have the same 5 panels that we cut for our main fabric: the front, the back, the left, the right, and the top. And we're also going to have the lining for our flap that we're using an extra accent fabric, and then the rectangle for the border of the handle opening. The extra inch that we added to our panels, the front, the back, the left, and the right, is so we can do this finishing border at the bottom of our sewing cover. So these are the finished 7 panels that we're going to have for our lining fabric. For our foam stabilizer, we're actually going to subtract and cut smaller panels than our actual dimensions. This is so the foam doesn't go all the way to the edges and we have room for our seam allowance. So these are the final measurements, and we're gonna end up having 6 different panels. So I chose this double-sided fusible bow saw because I love how light and easy to use this foam is. And also because it's double-sided fusible, it makes it easier to apply our lining. So these are our final panels. Remember that extra inch that we added to the length of our lining panels? This is so we can fold it in half and then create our finished border. So at this point, besides having the main panels, we also need the panels for our pockets and elastics, and also the accent fabric for our flap. Okay, so now we're ready to fuse our stabilizer. When you're placing your stabilizer, please make sure to leave at least the ½ inch at the top and make sure that it's centered. It's going to fuse quite quickly, so please make sure and take your time to center everything before you start ironing everything together. And we're gonna repeat this until we have all our panels fused together. You can see here that when we start sewing our panels together, having the foam not come all the way to the edges is going to make it easier for us to have that seam allowance a little bit cleaner. To finish the edges of our flap, we're going to use double fold bias tape. and I'm going to teach you how to sew the perfect corners. Okay, so now we're ready to start sewing our pockets. So for the pockets, I decided to use mesh fabric and fold over elastic. So it's a little bit stretchy to put our foot pedal and electric cord. So as I'm clipping here, I'm stretching my elastic to all the way to the border. If you want to use regular fabric for your pockets, click the link above to watch the previous cover. Alright, so the tip I give you here to sew our elastic is to make sure that it's right in the center, and then we're going to go slowly. Leave a long tail before you start sewing, and then it's easier to use it to pull as we sew forward. Just make sure that we're catching both sides of the elastic and everything looks aligned and centered. Also, as I'm sewing, I'm pulling the elastic to make sure that it's stretched and it's going to be all the way until the end. Perfect. Now you can tell how stretchy it's going to be. So we're going to do the same thing with the other pocket. So when we're sewing the bottom part of our pocket, we're going to gather our mesh fabric, kind of like we're creating a pleat. And we're going to go ahead and sew the sides of our pockets using only a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I like sewing both sides first and then the bottom, so it's easier for us to go ahead and gather the mesh fabric. I really like the see-through look of our mesh fabric, and also it's really practical to carry our foot pedal or bulky accessories. Now we're ready to finish our side panel by sewing the border. So I really like this method of finishing our borders by just having an extra inch of our lining fabric and folded it in half so we can sew it and create a very nice finish. So we're going to top stitch right at the edge. I like using my presser foot as a guide. And that's how we finish the border for our left and right panels. Now we're ready to start sewing the opening for our handle. So let's grab our template and then we're gonna go ahead and trace our rectangle directly to the top panel. So the template is exactly as the slide that we have at the beginning. Now we're ready to use that extra rectangle that we cut out from our lining to make the border. I like using lightweight fusible interfacing, the SF101. It just gives a little bit more body to the fabric. I'm going to use the same color thread for my bobbin as well, because I'm going to go ahead and do a border around it. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch to finish all the raw edges. Now that we have all the finished edges, we're going to center it with our rectangle and then align it at the top of our panel. Make sure that the pretty sides are facing together. We're going to use our template again so we can mark our rectangle and have a guide for sewing. So now we're going to sew right along the same line that we just marked. So sew all the way around the rectangle. Perfect, so we sewed all the way around, and now we're ready to mark the center where we're going to be cutting. Let's make a line in the center, and then from there, about an inch, we're going to go and meet the corners. To make our opening, we're going to go ahead and cut right along the lines that we just made. So making sure that every time that we reach the corners, we're not cutting any of the stitches. You can see all the layers that we have here, but we're actually going to push everything towards the lining. So we're going to push everything to the other side, and this is when we decide how thick we want our border to be. So just fiddle with it until you get it to the right point. We're going to get some extra foam that we need to cut off so we don't have extra bulk, and it's also covered by the panel that we just made. So we're gonna just cut having that rectangle as our reference. I'm using the fabric glue stick here to help me put everything in place. So fiddle with the corners a little bit, just making sure that we don't have a lot of the wrinkles. And then I use some clips just to hold everything in place. I like how everything is looking. I like the finished edges, and like the border gives a pop to our opening. When I made my markings, I used a disappearing ink pen that it disappears with the heat of the iron. So this is the same pen I'm using here to mark where we're gonna be sewing next. So I made a rectangle that's 1 inch all the way around, and we're gonna use it as our guide to sew all the way around and keep everything in place. I love how everything looks. Now that we just finished our opening, we're ready to start sewing the flap. To finish the raw edges for our flap, we're going to be using double fold bias tape. This one is 1/2 inch. To sew the perfect corners, I'm using my 45-degree ruler. You can also create a template out of cardstock just to use it as a guide. And create the fold by taking your bias tape to the right. Then holding everything in place, we're taking the bias tape all the way to the left, making sure that the fold that we just made aligns exactly to the right of our flap. Also, we're going to make sure to align the raw edge of our bias tape with the raw edge of the bottom of the flap. And now we're going to use the first fold of our bias tape as a guide to start sewing down. That first fold is 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to use that seam allowance to stop sewing right at that point. Then we're going to rotate everything and we're going to place our needle at that point. Start sewing with a back stitch and then sew all the way down. And now in this corner, we're going to repeat the same steps. We're going to stop sewing at the 3/8 inch mark, and then we're going to use our ruler or template to create that corner and then sew all the way down as well. Now we're ready to fold everything to the other side. Let's make sure that our corners are aligned at a 45 degrees angle and clip everything in place. Now we're ready to sew all the way around right at the edge, making sure that we're catching both sides of our bias tape. I love how the bias tape helped us create the perfect border for our flap. Now our last step to finish our top panel is to attach our flap. So let's make sure that it's centered with our opening, and we're going to go ahead and sew right at the top edge. I really like having the flap because it prevents the dust from going into the sewing machine. I wanted to have the opening to access the handle, but I also wanted to have something to keep my sewing machine protected. Now we're ready to start sewing the bottom borders of our panels. Now we gotta finish the borders for our front and back panel. It's easier if we start by pressing the folds and then clipping them in place. We're going to do this with both of our panels, and then we're gonna go ahead and top stitch right along the edge. And that's how we finish the borders for our panels. Now we're ready to start sewing the sides together. One of the main things that we have to have in mind when aligning our panels is the bottom edges. Let's make sure they are aligned to make the perfect base. Here we can see where the foam ends, so it's marking perfectly our seam allowance and creating a guide for us to follow. By not having the foam to come all the way to the edge, it makes it easier for us to go ahead and sew, so we don't have all that bulk when we're sewing along the edges. So right now I'm using a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. By taking the time to align our bottom borders, it creates a seamless line, but it also creates an even base. We used a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to give us room to use a 1/2 an inch seam allowance later on to finish the borders. Great, so we finished sewing our first panel. Now we're gonna do the same thing for our second panel. Facing the pretty sides together, we're gonna repeat the same step, aligning everything at the bottom and sew together our next panel. Now that we have all our panels sewn together, we're ready to close them. So we're gonna face our pretty sides together and sew along the edge. So this is very exciting. Our cover is starting to take shape. I'm actually turning everything right side out right now just to show you how everything looks. But for our next step, we're actually gonna sew everything inside out. So you actually don't have to turn everything right side out right now. Now we're ready to sew our top. To sew our top together, we gotta face our pretty sides of the fabric together. So let's go ahead and turn everything inside out again. Let's clip everything all the way around, making sure that all the corners are aligned. I like sewing one side at a time, making sure that I backstitch at the beginning and at the end. Just take your time, make everything flat, and follow your seam allowance. I like to finish the side with a backstitch, take the project out of the sewing machine, and then place everything again in the right corner. That helps me start right at the point where I left off. This is so exciting! Now let's turn everything right side out for the big reveal. Now the last step is to finish the raw edges on our lining. There are two ways that we can finish our border. We can top stitch with 1/2 inch seam allowance, like I did in the previous sewing machine cover. Please click the link above to watch the video and see the step on how it's done. That gives a little bit more structure to your sewing machine cover and a very nice finish as a top stitch. But I also wanted to show you a different way of finishing your borders for your lining. We're actually going to use a bias tape to finish the border and sew along the edges. I'm showing you here how I'm finishing my borders with the same bias tape that I use for my flap. It is a double fold bias tape, but if you can find a single fold that's a little bit smaller, it will work perfectly for the borders. To finish the end, I like to tuck it in and fold everything inwards so we don't have any of the raw edges showing. And we are all done. The bias tapes gives the perfect finish for our raw edges. I am really happy how this sewing machine dust cover turned out. I really love the fabric, it just goes perfectly in my sewing room, and it matches and coordinates with my previous sewing machine cover. So I'm really happy with the results. So please let me know if you have any questions and leave in the comments any of your suggestions or comments. Now I have this fabric available in my Spoonflower shop, so please visit my link to shop the fabric. I also have all the tutorials for all these sewing projects that you can see right now, so take your time to explore my YouTube channel and videos. Thank you so much for sewing along with me. Have an amazing day.